Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Michel de Montaigne's essay on anger in French de la colère is drawn in parts from other earlier authors who he brings up, like, for example, Plutarch, but also Seneca and others. But it's also got some interesting observations that he himself will make, and at the end he'll tell us about his own attitudes and experiences with this emotion. And he begins by talking about Plutarch and bringing up Aristotle. And the concern here is about how we actually treat other people, particularly those who are in vulnerable positions. So the reason why he brings up Aristotle is Aristotle says the majority of our polities or political associations are like that of the Cyclops, abandoning the guidance of the women and children to each individual man, according to his mad and injudicious ideas, right? And so he's actually going to be saying something like, there ought to be a law. And why? Because he sees a problem that still exists in our own time, namely that parents mistreat their children out of anger. And so he's going to tell us, how many times have I been tempted, among other things, to make a dramatic intervention so as to avenge some little boys who I saw being bruised, knocked about, and flayed alive by some frenzied father or mother beside themselves with anger. So you notice that he's not just saying fathers, but also mothers. You can see fire and rage flashing from their eyes. And he's going to say this is a sign of how badly off they are because, according to Hippocrates, the most dangerous of distempers are those which contort the face. And this is a sort of commonplace of anger. It distorts our appearance. We see this in Seneca's work on anger. And then he goes and he says that children are crippled and knocked stupid by such batterings, but our judicial system takes no note of it. And instead, the state should be intervening in some way. Why? Because what you're doing is you're damaging the very limbs of the state, which are put out of joint and maimed. And he's going to go on further and say, listen, there's significant problems with anger. No passion, as he says, disturbs, dérange, the soundness, the sincérité of our judgment as anger does. It makes us badly off with respect to the targets that we're going to direct it at. And he says, nobody would hesitate to punish with death a judge who is led to condemn his man as a criminal out of anger. So why do we let fathers and mothers do this to children? And then here he expands it a little bit as well. And schoolmasters, right? Schoolmasters being another group of people that children are placed with, and the children are vulnerable to them. So he goes on and says, that is no longer correction, it is vengeance. For a child, punishment is a medicine. Would we tolerate a doctor who is animated by wrath against their patient? What anger does is it makes us bad at applying punishment, because punishment, what does it mean to say it should be medicine? It should be used so as to make the person who is being punished better off through the punishment, not just to inflict pain on them, revenge, cruelty, to vent one's spleen, so to speak. And he says that, and this is sort of, again, a commonplace of the literature on anger. We ourselves, if we would act properly, would never lay a hand on our servants as long as anger lasts, while our pulse is beating and we feel the emotion. Let us put off the encounter. Things will look different to us once we've cooled off a bit and quieted down. Until then, the passion is in command. Passion does all the talking, not us. And then he says, faults seen through anger are like objects seen through a mist. They appear larger, right? So, if we want the punishments, because we often do have to impose some sort of sanctions, to be effective, we need to do so when we're not or no longer angry. He says, punishments after being judiciously weighed are more acceptable and more useful to the sufferer. Otherwise, he doesn't think he's been justly condemned by a man shaking with anger and fury. He cites in his own justification the inflamed face of the schoolmaster, his unaccustomed swearing, his mental disturbance, and precipitous haste. So this is a really important set of advice, reflections on how anger and punishment should be dissociated from each other, particularly when we're talking about somebody who's a superior and somebody who is inferior and vulnerable to them. Then he goes into an interesting discussion, which seems to be kind of a side digression, but actually isn't, about saying and doing. He says, saying is one thing, doing is another. We must consider the preaching apart and the preacher apart, because there's a lot of people who don't, if we want to bring up another metaphor, walk the walk when they're talking the talk, right? So, he says a lot of people will say, oh, that person's a hypocrite, just ignore them. And Montaigne won't go that far. He says that a man of good morals may hold false opinions, a wicked man may preach the truth, even truths he doesn't believe. It is most certainly harmonious and beautiful when saying and doing go together. I have no wish to deny that saying has more authority and efficacy when followed by doing. And he brings up some examples here. Cicero, doesn't always follow through on what he says by comparison to Brutus. Seneca and Cicero talking about contempt for death. Well, Seneca showed it, Cicero not so much. Then he's going to talk about Plutarch. So Plutarch for him is kind of a model of this. He says, the writings of Plutarch, if you savor them well, adequately reveal him, and I believe that I know Plutarch penetrating even into his soul. I wish we had some personal memoirs, but I feel, some gratitude towards Aulus Gellius for having told us something about Plutarch. Now, we're coming back to anger. What did this guy do? Well, so one of Plutarch's slaves, a bad, wicked man whose ears had drunk in a few lectures in philosophy, was stripped for some crime by order of Plutarch. He's being flogged. So he's being beaten with a whip, and he snarls about it not being right, that he didn't do anything wrong. In the end, he changes his tactic. He says, you're not a good master. You're not really the philosopher that you brag about being, because I know in your books you actually say don't punish a servant if you're angry with them. And Plutarch says, oh, buddy, I'm not angry at you. Look at me. Do I look angry? I'm calm, right? And so there's nothing wrong with me having you punished at this time. Does my face, my voice, my coloring, or my speech bear any witness to my being excited? I don't think my eyes are wild, my face distorted, or my voice terrifying. Am I foaming at the mouth? Am I shaking with wrath? And so he tells the other guy, carry on with the flogging while this man and I are having a discussion, right? And we see some other examples of this brought up as well. Archytas of Tarentum finds in his house mismanagement, his land's laying fallow. He summons the steward, and he says, if I were not so angry, I would give you a good going over. Plato, when he was inflamed against the slaves, hands him over to his nephew Speusippus for punishment. We could go on and on about this, right? So it's not that you never punish, but you don't want to be punishing while you're angry. Then he's going to tell us something else about anger. And again, you can find things like this in Seneca, in Plutarch. Anger is a passion which delights in itself, or literally is pleased by itself, se plaît en soi, and fawns upon itself. And so he says, how often when we're worked up for some wrong reason and offered some good defense or excuse, we wind up getting vexed against, disputons contre, truth itself and innocence itself. So, anger can lead us into all sorts of cognitive defects, you could say. And so he brings up this guy, Piso, who, again, Seneca talks about as well. He's kind of a poster child for bad anger. Piso is totally in the wrong, and because of that, takes it out on some other people as well, getting them executed. And then he brings up another really interesting feature of anger. Anger tends to seek out opposition to it. And the angry person can get angrier because they're not getting the pushback that they are desiring. He says that Kellius the orator was of a marvelously choleric nature. There was a man of mild and gentle manners, so as not to provoke him, decided to approve of everything he said and to agree with him. Kellius could not tolerate that his evil temper should pass unfed and exclaimed, for the God's sake, challenge something so there can be two of us, right? And then Montaigne says something kind of interesting about gender relations. He says that women, when they get angry, they try to provoke men into getting angry at them so that they can have a good fight. And he tells us that this imitates the laws of love. Now, what do you think he means by that? Well, it wants a certain kind of reciprocity. When we love, feel desire, we're infatuated with somebody, we want that to be going in the opposite direction to us as well from that person. So when we're angry at somebody, we want them to get angry at us so we can have a good fight. And he says that, when you don't fight with them, they get angrier. He talks about another person, Phocion, when a man kept interrupting what he was saying with bitter insults, just stop talking, giving him enough time to exhaust his anger. When that was over, he took up his speech where he'd left off. No retort goads a person more sharply than disdain like that. When you say, I'm not going to engage with you about that. So he also talks about whether we should or shouldn't restrain anger. And by restrain it, that means when we're feeling it, should we actually express it outwardly or not? He tells us about two different people, one of whom is one of the most choleric men in France, right? And he says that to moderate his anger, he has to keep himself under cruel restraint. And he goes on, he says, personally, I know of no passion of mine for which I could ever make so great an effort to hide and withstand. I don't rate wisdom so high a price at that. And then he talks about another guy who's boasting about the gentle correctness of his manners, which was truly unique. And I replied that it was indeed something to present oneself always moderate to the world, but the main thing was to provide inwardly for myself. To my taste, a man was not managing the business well if, and this is a big if, we don't know about this guy, he was eating his insides out. He says, I am afraid he was doing that to maintain the mask of that outward appearance of correctness. But we don't really know, do we? And Montaigne didn't really know. And he says, if we repress our anger and don't express it, we drive it into our bodies, which is not a good thing. So he says, we should be willing to let some of our anger out, but we got to be careful with it. He adds to this that It's important not to express it all the time, because if we do, then people will be like, oh, they're just angry again, and they won't take us seriously, or on stupid, foolish, trivial matters. He says, I advise those in my family who have the right to show their anger, be sparing of it. Don't scatter it abroad no matter what the cost. That thwarts its action and its weight. If you vent anger on a servant for theft, it might make no impression. Then it's the same anger he's seen you use against him 100 times already for a glass badly rinsed or a stool left out of place. Trivial matters. So if you want your anger to actually accomplish anything, maybe don't get so angry all the time. It's sort of like the old story of the boy who cried wolf, right? Crying wolf all the time, people aren't going to believe you after a while. And he also talks about people who boast and bluster in quarrels where there's no actual adversary, right? And then he's going to tell us about his own case. He's going to finish up by saying, when I get angry, it is lively but short and as secret as I can make it. I lose control quickly and violently, but not with such turmoil. I go gaily hurling about all sorts of insults at random and fail to lodge my goads where I think they do the most damage. Normally I use only my tongue, not hitting people. My servants get off more cheaply in serious cases than little ones. The little ones take me by surprise. I lose my temper there. And when it comes to big things, he says, where everyone expects me to give birth to justified anger, I glory in disappointing their expectations. I prepare and brace myself against those serious cases. So we can imagine him carrying out some exercise. I know I'm going to get ticked off about this, so I'd better be on my guard against that anger. And he says, this is the bargain I strike with those who may have to contend with me. When you see I'm the first to get worked up, just let me go on. Right or wrong, I'll do the same in return. The storm is engendered only by the confluence of callers, he says, right? So people getting angry at each other, that's what he tries to avoid. Instead, let us allow each to run its course, then we always have peace. And he says, this is a good prescription, difficult in practice. And then he finishes by noting that every once in a while he fakes getting angry in order to govern his household, right? Which again is something that we see coming up in ancient authors. Seneca advises doing this. Seneca thinks that anger is always bad, but it's okay for a judge to pretend to be angry at a criminal if that will keep the criminal from committing more crimes, right? So, some very interesting reflections here on a complex and difficult emotion that can easily lead us into all sorts of problems. Montaigne is not advising us to get angry whenever we can. He's actually providing us with some quite helpful prescriptions for what to do with anger when we encounter it and feel it, and some condemnations of how far people let their anger go.